And last week we ended with I kind of closed with this illustration about a thing they have in baseball called the sacrifice fly. And that's where the batter is instructed by the coach to just hit the ball as far as he can, knowing that it's going to be caught by the outfield and he'll be out, but it'll give it a chance for the runners to advance and possibly score. But the batter has the right. He has the right to do whatever he wants to. He's at bat. He's got the bat in his hands. He can do whatever. He can take a strike. He can go for the home run. He can lay down a bunt. He can do any of that. But if he doesn't do what the coach says, he's not being a very good team player. And so with that kind of as a background for what we're going to be looking at today, I think that's kind of a setup for what Paul's going to be talking about in our text today. And some of you have heard me many times, I'll say something like, pay attention because this is going to be on the test. And life is a series of tests. I mean, that's basically why we're here right now. That's why God leaves us here when we accept the Lord as our Savior. The reason why He didn't take us directly to heaven is because we are here. I mean, there's several reasons, but one of the main reasons is so that He can leave us here. And we go through a series of experiences that the Bible calls tests for the purpose of maturing us and growing us up, conforming into His image. So life is going to be a series of tests. And that's going to be kind of the main thing we'll be talking about this morning, is life as a test. There was 4 teenagers, high school kids, that had played hooky one morning, and they came into class in the middle of the afternoon, and they reported to their teacher that they were late because they had had a flat on the way to school. And teacher said, that's fine, that sort of thing happens, but go ahead and take your seats. The only thing is that there was an oral test today, and you'll have to take that to make it up. And they thought, man, we just dodged a bullet. And so they sat down, and she said, okay, first question on the test is, which tire was it? And that's kind of, life is a series of tests, and we kind of look at things, we call them trials sometimes. When we're going through life and things happen, we call them trials, but the Lord calls them tests. And it's kind of important that we get the test. We score well on the test, that's kind of the goal. And sometimes it's important for us to pay attention because this will be on the test, And for example, I'm just going to give you a series of, there's some answers that were given by 11-year-old on the science tests that they took. And so on the earth science section of it, Caden said this. He said, water is composed of 2 gens, oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen is pure gin, and hydrogen is gin and water. It kind of makes me wonder who Caden's, what his life experiences at home were like, but that he would have that kind of conclusion. Audrey said that when you smell an odorless gas, it's probably carbon monoxide. And then Joshua gave this answer. The tides are a fight between the earth and the moon. All the water tends toward the moon because there's no water on the moon. And we know that nature abhors a vacuum. And I forget where the sun fits into this. So that was Joshua. And Joshua also said, a fossil is an extinct animal. The older it is, the more extinct it is, which I think is somewhat true. And Ebony wrote this. She said, mushrooms always grow in damp places, so they look like umbrellas. And then there was this one part of the test that was to give the definition of the following terms, and Jeremy wrote these answers. First one was define a planet. And he said, it's a body of earth surrounded by sky. And then on the second one, for a vacuum, he said, it's a large empty space where the Pope lives. He lives there in the vacuum. Now on the health science section of the test, Caleb had some pretty definitive answers regarding our respiratory and circulatory system. And he said respiration is composed of 2 acts. First, inspiration, and then expectoration. And when you breathe, he said, you inspire. And when you do not breathe, he said, you expire. So he paid attention, I'm sure. And before a blood transfusion, he said, find out if the blood is affirmative or negative. That's always important, you know. And then Jeremy said this. He said, blood flows down one leg. Here he is. He says, blood flows down one leg, and then it flows up the other. And when continuing on the body part of health science, he says that the body consists of three parts: the brainstem, the borax, and the abdominal cavity. The brainstem contains the brain. The borax contains the heart and the lungs, and the abdominal cavity contains the bowels, of which there are 5: A, E, I, O, and U. The 5 bowels. Okay, so it's important to pay attention to life because it will be on the test, right? Paul, continuing in chapter 9, he's been talking about the freedoms that we have in Christ versus the responsibilities that we have in Christ. Or we could say, where is the dividing line between my freedoms and walking in love toward my fellow man? And he says, for though I am free from all men, verse 19 of chapter 9, though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Now, Paul was the quintessential Jew, you understand. I mean, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He had sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He had studied Torah. He knew what Judaism was all about. He didn't have to become a Jew. He was a Jew. When you looked up the word Jew in the dictionary, there was a picture of Paul. So when he says that, he's not saying that, but he's just saying that when he's around Jewish people, he's going to act like Jewish people. He's not putting on airs or putting on a front. He just wants them to, he's going to do it for the sake of them. He had actually been set free from the confines of Judaism. He didn't have to do that anymore. But for love's sake, he would do that. So it wasn't a matter of him becoming one. He just would do that for the sake of those that he would be ministering to. And then he says in verse 21, and to those who are without the law, meaning the Gentiles, those who weren't part of Judaism, as without the law, not being without law toward God. You know, in other words, he's not going to live immorally or go against the moral law of God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. He's not saying that I'm going to go out and party hardy like the Gentiles do just so I can be accepted by the Gentiles. You know, I'm not going to go have a drink with a friend and win him to the Lord, you know, kind of a thing. He's not having that sort of attitude, but he's just saying that I'm going to throw off the trappings of my Judaism when I'm around the Gentiles so they'll feel more comfortable around me. And he says, to the weak, verse 22, I became as weak, that I might win the weak. And I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So with some that are in between, you know, maybe they aren't caught up in the shackles of paganism, and maybe they don't come from all the trappings of Judaism, but they're just there, and they don't know what they want, they don't know what they believe. He said, I want them to feel comfortable around me as well. And it's all for the sake of, in other words, what Paul is saying is, I can do anything that I want to do because Jesus paved the way, he paid the price, he took the penalty. There are no rules that would restrict me. But when it comes to winning somebody to the Lord, when it comes to ministering to someone who doesn't understand that, maybe they're caught up in legalism, or maybe they're caught up in libertinism, just the party hardy thing, and they're in between the two, then I'm going to show them what the road in between looks like. And now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker of it with you. You know, it would sound, when we just read these few verses here, where Paul is, you know, saying, when I'm around the Jews, I'm like the Jews. When I'm around the Gentiles, I'm like a Gentile. You know, you could, and I've heard people have this takeaway, you know, that Paul was some sort of compromising, lily-livered Miktos, acquiescing, sort of soft pedaling man pleaser, just everything he just, whatever people wanted him to do, that's what he would do. And it was anything but that. He's actually, what he was saying was just the opposite of that. But what he was saying is, my rights end at love's door. I have the right to do anything I want to, but when it comes to when love is a matter, it comes into the equation, then I set that right aside. Do you not know that those, this is verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, and one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. If you ever watch the Olympics, you ever watch track and field, and you've got all of the runners, and on any kind of, depending upon the type of race, you could have, 7, 8, 10, 20 different runners, 100 different runners, depending upon the race. And there's not a single one of them that starts off that race thinking, if I'm not ahead of the pack, if I'm not going to win this thing, I'm quitting. They don't start off with that mindset. And understanding sometimes in the marathon, the long distance, when people physically aren't able to, but nobody quits the race. They don't start off the race and then quit it. And so he's saying, don't you know that everybody that starts running there was very little that was more important to the Greeks than the games. They didn't have ESPN. They didn't have 57 sports channels. They didn't have all the different kind of leagues and college ball and all of that stuff then. They had the games. They were just the games. They didn't even have to say what kind of games they were because there was only one. It was just the games. And the only thing that was more important than the Athenian games, that was where the main ones were, that was the big one, that was the Olympics, was the Isthmian Games. And the Isthmian Games were held in Corinth. And this was big. I mean, this is who Paul's writing to. He's writing to the Corinthians. And when he gives this analogy in verse 24, they're all like, yeah, I know what that's all about. Probably many of the people that he was addressing were part of that. Very little was more important to these guys than the games. And he says, everyone, verse 25, everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now, the word temperate, if you're reading from the New American Standard, it's the word self-control. And that's probably a better translation. We think of the word temperate, and you think, well, that means moderate. Just to be all things in moderation. That's some people's mantra. And but it's better understanding of what Paul's saying here with the word self-control. That he who competes for the prize is going to exercise self-control in all things. We tend to look at temperate and moderate as not being too much of extreme in either way. All things in moderation. And while there's some substance to that, there's an element of that that's true. That's not what Paul's talking about. The NIV says strict training. And that might even be better. That he who competes in the games is serious about the strict training, the regimen that they're going to hold to. I've shared this before. It's been a while, so probably many of you haven't. But everybody's been in the gym. You've all at some point seen the guy that is the self-appointed king of the gym. We used to go to this gym, and this guy was a competitive professional bodybuilder. He's one of these guys that shaves his whole body and greased it all up, and just, he would, do this and this and this. And, everything about this guy's life was regimented. And he had this little group of groupies, these gym rats that would follow him around, and they would ask him questions, and they said, well, how much liquids do you take in first thing in the morning, and when, how far do you run before you eat breakfast, and what's your carb versus protein intake, and all of it, and everything about this guy's life was regimented about how he can get a little deeper cut, a little bigger rip. Just that he might just get that little bit of competitive edge over the competition. And that's kind of the idea of what Paul's talking about here. And someone who competes, they're going to be very strict about the training that they participate in. Damian Kyle tells the story about the guy that went up to, he was on the track team, and he went up to the coach and he says, "Coach, can I smoke and still run track?" And the coach looked at him and he said, "Well, yes, you can smoke and still run track. You just can't smoke and still win. You know, I mean, so that's up to you. You know, I mean, if you don't care about winning, then go ahead, you know, sleep in late, stay up late, you know, eat too much fat. You know, if you don't care about that, then that's the thing." And what Paul is doing is he's drawing this parallel. Is he just talking about track and field here? Is he just talking about the games? Of course not. He's drawing this parallel between spiritual training to that of an athlete. And he says the one who competes in the games participates in very strict training. And I just, you know, I was going over that this weekend, you know, just preparing for this morning, and I asked myself, how strict am I in my training? Obviously not very strict in the physical side of things, but Paul is talking about the spiritual side of things. You know, what do I consider to be the regimen for preparing for the spiritual games? You know, Paul is saying that he understands Christian rights. You know, I don't know that we need to go back over that again, but you know, what he's saying is you can talk about rights all day long, but when it comes to whether or not my rights are going to somehow impede somebody else's coming to Christ or growth in Christ, then we're not talking about my rights. When I was a kid, you know, most kids kind of have this, you know, when I grow up, this is what I want to be, you know. Well, I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. I wanted to play center field. And this was back in the day, you know, back in, you know, when I was growing up, it was back in the early 60s and stuff, and the flip sunglasses were pretty popular, you know. And I just thought, if I had a pair of those, you know, if I had a pair of those sunglasses that you could just kind of flip up and flip down, you know, you could be flipping down right before you catch it, you know, so the sun's not glaring. I thought, that's all I need. You know, if I get a pair of those glasses, I'm going to be in MLB. You know, I just knew that I would be playing for the Yankees someday if I could get a pair of those sunglasses. They were like $3 or $4 though, and I didn't know where I was going to get the money. But you know, that's the thing is, if I had a pair of those sunglasses, I'd have been all show and no go. You know, I mean, it was just it would be it'd be all accessorizing and no sacrificing. You know, it'd be all hat, no cattle. It would just been just me kind of acting like I was something that I wasn't. Because it takes something to be a Major League Baseball player. It takes something to be a professional athlete. And that word is sacrifice. In fact, it takes serious sacrifice. It takes, to win, it takes absolute sacrifice. And Paul is taking that analogy, the sports analogy, and carrying it over into the spiritual world. And he says, and those guys that do that, those guys that are very strict in their regimentation, he said, look what the rest of the verse says. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. You know, Paul says this isn't about legalism. You know, somebody can say, "Well, Paul, you're just being legalistic, you know, because you're not gonna do this and you're not gonna do that, and that's just you're being legalistic." This is the antithesis of legalism. Okay, what Paul is saying is anything but legalism. He's saying that he was saved, sanctified, and one day will be glorified by the grace of Jesus Christ. Period. I mean, there's no legalism involved in that. There's nothing that he does in that equation, you know, from every bit of it is the Lord. But he says, but because of that grace that saves, sanctifies, and will one day glorify him, he says, I'm going to persevere. Because of that grace, I'm going to do whatever it takes. And the prize of the games, if you ran one of the events and won, your prize was a twig. That's what you'd get. You'd get this sprig, this little broken little sprig of a laurel bush, and they would tie it into a little circlet, and they'd put that on your head, and then you could walk around, because you got a twig on your head, And for as long as that twig lasted, you had bragging rights. I mean, those guys, they did more than strut. I mean, when you would get that twig, you could go into stores, and you go into a restaurant, and they'd feed you for free. You'd go into stores, they'd give you, because you had the twig, I mean, that was important. That was a really important thing for about 24 hours. But the thing about twigs is they're not twigs very long. They turn into sticks real fast, And so that's what they would do that for, though, would be for this perishable crown. They'd have this sprig that they would tie into a ring, put it on their head, and then they could wear that for about a day, and then they'd start all over again. As long as it was green, they were rock stars. But as soon as it started turning brown, they had to run another race. They had to go win again. Because the prize for what the athletes ran for was only temporary. Those victories that they would win, we could say would be the epitome of temporary, because, just look at the prize that they got for it. He says, so therefore, verse 26, he says, therefore, this is how I'm going to run. Therefore, I run this, not with uncertainty. And this is how I fight. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, not as one who shadow boxes. As I'm running this race, as I'm competing in this spiritual race, that these spiritual games, we could say, this is how I'm doing it. I'm going all out. C.S. Lewis had this to say about the passage. He said, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. We were talking about this yesterday in our men's prayer breakfast, and we were going through this book about coming to the end of ourselves, just what I would always term getting over our bad selves, so we had a really good discussion yesterday in our men's prayer about how we have to empty ourselves so that he can fill us. And yet the problem with that is, how do we get completely emptied? Because there's always some little bauble, some little dangle, some little twig that the world throws at us that we go, oh, I want that. And that becomes more important to us than the spiritual truths that our faith is all about. And so we set the spiritual truth of our faith aside so that we can go after the twig. Because, as Lewis says, we're far too easily pleased. It has nothing to do with salvation, really not anything necessarily to do with sanctification, although we can understand how that would fit into it. But it has nothing at all to do with the grace of God. It's almost like an affront to the grace of God. It's like we just say, well, I know I got your grace, God, and so I'm just going to grace out now with my twig. I mean, who would train, who just going back to the image of that Jim King that I remember from years ago. Who would do the things that he went? He would train, and he would run, and he would his diet, just everything in his diet. I mean, there was not a thing that passed his lips that didn't have something to do with his goal. There was never a day off. There was never a meal off. There was never, everything, his life was all. Who would do that? Who would go through all of that trouble, all of that effort, all that sacrifice, all that pain, and then not compete? And then not show up for the race, not show up for the competition? Oh, I know. We would. Yeah, we would, because it's so easy for us to get distracted. Paul writes to the Galatians in chapter 5, verse 3, he says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only don't use your liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another." Isn't that just like the nutshell of what Paul's talking about in these chapters? I mean, we could say that this section of 1 Corinthians is just a commentary. It's an expanded, it's the amplified version of Galatians 5:13. He says, continuing in verse 27, he says, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I find that I should become disqualified." The word disqualified here in the original language is the word adikamos, and it probably means, better translation would be to fail the test. It doesn't mean that you get kicked out or anything like that, but there was a test. Here's a test that you were, life is a series of tests, and so here's this test, and we become disqualified from that test because we didn't prepare right, and so therefore we didn't get the test right, and so we failed that test. And so usually what that happens as far as life goes, usually, as long as we live long enough for that to be the case, usually when we fail that test, then God says, okay, well, we'll just have to do this test over again. Sometimes when we fail the test, I'll go, "Oh, Lord, I sure did learn my lesson here. You wanted me to live by faith. You wanted me to keep my eyes on you as I was going through this thing, and I didn't do it. And I'm sorry, Lord, and I sure learned my lesson. And so thank you for this lesson in life, because I've learned how to walk by faith now." And he says, "No, you haven't. What you've learned how to say is you're sorry because you didn't walk by faith. So now we're going to have to go through this test again. We're going to have to go through this experience once again and see if you can walk by faith this time." And God is gracious enough, should we live long enough, that he allows us, if we fail the test, then he allows us to go through it again so that we can not become disqualified. The word adikamos, it's got the alpha in front of the A that means the opposite. Whatever follows it means the opposite of that. Kind of like it's similar to UN in English. We put that UN in front of a word, and it means the opposite of what the word is. If somebody is uncool, that means they're not cool. If something is unnecessary, that means it wasn't necessary. If something is adikamos, it means it didn't pass the test. And so we go through life lessons again. When we fail one life lesson, then God says, okay, you got to do it again, so that the next time we can be dikamos. That we cannot become disqualified. We would become qualified. Literally what the word means literally is so that I wouldn't be disapproved. And so God could just say, as we go through that test the second time, you can say, okay, got it. Yay. Now, next test. and then he takes us on to the next one. Jesus gives the example in one of his parables, that's the type of heaven, and he says, as those that have been good stewards over the things that he entrusts to them, he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord." And I wonder, is there any Christian who is not going to hear that? Is there really anybody who's truly born again, who, when we stand before the Lord, he doesn't say, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord"? Maybe he says it with different levels of his voice, Maybe there's different levels of excitement that he gives with it, but is it something that, I don't know. I don't know. But what I can say is that Paul fully understood that concept. And you see, I think far too many of us, what the problem is, we worry about, gosh, I don't want to not hear that, so I better do whatever I can so that I could hear it. Even if he just does it in a whisper, that's good enough for me, because it's just I made it. But Paul is saying, I just want to hear him shout it from the top of his lungs. And so whatever I do in this life to prepare for it is good for me. It's not a theological statement here. It's not some sort of discourse on what heaven is like. It's just Paul is saying, I understand what well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord is all about. And he wanted that to be his case. And so when we come to chapter 10, he's going to give, he starts off because the Corinthian church was primarily Gentile. And so they didn't really understand the Jewish way of things. And so he's going to start off with this kind of a Jewish, an Israel history primer for his Gentile audience. And so he says, moreover, brethren. So, no chapter break in the letter. He's still, I don't think he's even changed context now. He's just kind of expanding more. And he says, moreover, brethren, I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from that spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was Christ. There's a Jewish tradition. Remember when they first got into the wilderness and they were thirsty. They ran out of water, and they said, all we brought was, we thought we were going to the promised land, and here we are in the middle of the desert. We don't have no water. And so Moses went to the Lord and he says, what are we going to do about water? And he says, see that rock over there, Mo? And he said, yeah. And he goes, take your stick and go over there and hit that rock. And so he did, and water gushed out of it. And then we fast forward 40 years, and wandering, we wandered around 40 years, and there's another time when they're out of water, and so they're complaining to Moses, and so he goes to Moses, Moses goes to the Lord, and he said, Lord, guess what? They're complaining about water again. And he said, will you see that rock over there, Moses? And he said, yeah. And he said, go speak to that rock. Just go over to that rock and say, rock, we're thirsty. And so he said, okay, and he walks away, and he looks at the people. Moses looks at the people, and he goes, must we bring water from this rock? Including himself in the equation. He says, must we bring water from this rock? And went over and struck it with a stick again. And God said, Moses, I want to see you in my office. He said, that's no, the rock was only going to be, the rock which was Christ, the rock was only to be struck once. And from then on, it's to be spoken to. And the rock, Jesus, was stricken once, and now all we have to do is. But the rabbis had this tradition, because of those two events, they had this rabbinic tradition that this rock, as they were wandering around the wilderness for 40 years, this rock followed them, all the way through the desert, just kind of leaving this big rock track through the sands. And whenever they needed water, they just went over there and hit it, and some more water came out. Because of that, that's what the rabbis taught. Now, if God wanted this rock to follow them around in the desert to bring them water, he could have done that. Or wanted this rock to do that, he could. Cake, But Paul tells us here that the rock was really, we're talking spiritual thing. Yeah, it happened back then. It was literal that it happened back then, but he's not saying there was a literal rock that followed around him. It was all as a lesson for them to learn about Jesus. And he says, but with most of them, God was not well pleased. This is verse 5. For most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, Numbers chapter 1 tells us it was roughly around 600,000 adult men that were part of that group. It doesn't count the Levites because, they were kind of separate from the other 10 tribes in whenever censuses were taken, usually. But there was roughly around a little over 600,000 men. So between 600,000 and 600,500, somewhere in that scope of the men that left Israel. And as we know, they were in the wilderness 40 years. It is what's often been termed the longest funeral procession in the history of the world. And over 1 million people died during this time period. And if we look at this map, it only takes about 10 days, less than 2 weeks, to go from the land of Goshen, where they were at, there in northern Egypt, to the land of Canaan. If they had just walked from there, from point A to point B, 2 weeks less than. And yet that's not the way God took them. He could have done that. He could have done it and got it all over with, but there were some lessons about faith that he wanted them to learn. And so instead of taking them that way, he took them down to Sinai. Now there are two two places that could be identified with Sinai. And if you were raised in Sunday school, you've always seen this place down at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula because it's historically the place of where Mount Sinai was, Mount Horeb, and where the Ten Commandments took place and everything. And that's traditionally the place. And it could be. It's since the 2nd century AD, it's been identified as a place, but there's a lot of modern science that's gone into the idea that they had cut across the Sinai Peninsula and crossed over the Red Sea there in the Gulf of Aqaba, and that actually Mount Sinai is in what's today Saudi Arabia. And whichever place, that's where God took them to. He took them to there, and then from that, that's where they got the Ten Commandments and everything. And from there, he led them up to a place that's kind of right at the southern part of what's Israel today, known as Kadesh Barnea. And he took them up there, and it's kind of like it was a border town for the land of Canaan in those days. And that's where they sent the 12 spies. They took one from each of the 12 tribes, and they sent them into the land of Canaan to go check out the land. And when they came back, they were saying, all 12 of them were like, man, you just can't believe. No wonder God said it's a land flowing with milk and honey. A cluster of grapes has to be put on a stick and carried by 2 men. That's what this place is like. But you think those grapes are big? Man, you ought to see the people, you know. They're giants, and we're like grasshoppers compared to them. There's no way we can go in there, you know. As rich as that land is, the people are just too much of an obstacle. 10 of them said that. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, yeah, that's all true, but God said that he'll give it to us if we just go in there. And so it says, and so the people listened to the 10 instead of the 2, and because of that, they ended up spending the next 40 years just kind of walking around in circles. That whole generation that left the land of Goshen, that left Egypt, had to die off. Their carcasses were buried there in the desert. And the next generation grew up, and they were the ones that inherited the land. Only Joshua and Caleb were the 2 that were able to enter into to the promised land. He was not pleased, you know, out of the 600,000, he was not pleased with 599,998. And the Bible says, not all, but most. You know, he was not pleased with all of them. Well, most of them he wasn't pleased with. And these, now verse 6 says, they become our example, to the intent that we should not lust after things as they also lusted. Numbers chapter 11, verse 4. You know, that's book of Numbers does a lot of talking about this time period of them in the wilderness. And in verse 4 it says, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Now the mixed multitude were either the people who the children of Israel had intermarried with the Egyptians, and so they were mixed multitude, or they were just Egyptians who saw the hand of God working in the 10 plagues and just said, we're not staying around here anymore, we're going with you guys. And so they went with them, thinking that by leaving Egypt they'll be on God's good side. And so it says that the mixed multitude, they got tired of the manna. And they started affecting the Israelites with the same complaints. And I just every time I read Numbers 11:4, it just takes me, I think of Edward G. Robinson, you know, when he goes up to Chuck Heston and he goes, well, who's going to give us meat to eat then, Moses? You know, and then all the Israelites started saying the same thing. And so what God did because of that is he sent them some quail. You ever had quail? Pretty good munching. I mean, that's it says that the manna tasted like pastry, which pastry is pretty good, but if all you eat is cherry pie morning, noon, and night for like a couple of years, you're going to be longing for some meat, you know? And quail is some good meat. And they were complaining about God's provision. They wanted something that was a little more variety in it. And so he said, well, here's what I'll do. I'm going to send you some quail. And he sent them a bunch of quail. I mean, I'm going to send you so much quail, God said, they're going to be coming out your nostrils. Now, quail tastes pretty good going in, but that wouldn't be very good quail. He said, I'm going to send you so much, it's going to be coming out your nostrils. And so they came flying in right about strike zone high. And so all the Israelites, they grabbed their Louisville sluggers, and they were just kind of like this as they came in. No, I'm serious. They did. It's in the Bible. It is. Look, in verse 32 it says, and all the people stayed up all that night, all day, and all the next day, and gathered the quail, and he who gathered the least gathered 10 homers. Yeah, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Now, Philippians 4:19. Many of us, if I just say Philippians 4:19, you know the verse. Philippians 4:19 says that God will supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory. Somewhere along the line, it's become translated to us, I think mainly in the West, somewhere along the line has come to us where we think that it says that God's going to supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory. And he can do that, and sometimes does. But there's no guarantee that he's going to do that, because he's more interested in our spiritual life than our greedy temporal life. He's more interested in a spiritual reward than a stick. And so it's Psalm 116, it's talking about this. In Psalm 116, just a couple of verses of it, he says, they soon forgot his works, and they did not wait for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness, and they tested God in the desert. And he gave them their request, but sent leanness to their souls, to their soul. Now, when we read that, we can go, oh, man, that's convicting. But if you'd have been an Israelite, and you turn back the clock 3,500 years, and you're in the desert, and you're eating cherry pie, morning, noon, and night, day after day, week after week, month after month, and it goes into the years, and you're still eating cherry pie. And then you got all these kind of sort of people that are with you, this mixed multitude going, Moses, and they're starting to affect you. And God says, I'll tell you what, I can give you some quail if you think that's really going to do the trick. But if I do, I'm going to satisfy your request, but you're going to have leanness in your soul as a result. What would you do? I mean, I know what you would do sitting here in the chair looking at me on Sunday morning when we're still trying to get over Thanksgiving dinner. I know the answer now, but what would you do then? What would I do? I read Psalm 116 and I go, boy, I just can't believe those guys did that. But what would I have done? Could you imagine just wanting to give up spiritual blessings? They're not saying they lost their salvation. It's not saying that they're going to hell. It's just saying that he satisfied this lust that they had, and in return for that, there was no presence of God in their life. Yeah, but I still get to go to heaven? Is that what you're saying? Like I can have that leanness in my soul, but I still get to go to heaven? I think that's the epitome of what Paul's talking about here. He says, and verse 7, he says, and don't become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose up to play. Did they still get to go to heaven? Well, I suppose some of them did, but the idolaters didn't. because I know there's a lot of people that pose as Christians, especially here in the Bible Belt. You know, we got this poser thing going on, and we know how to act like it when we're supposed to act like it. But, I mean, in the final analysis, are we really born again? You know, well, I hope I am. Well, I think I am. My goodness, what a way is it, to live is that, you know? And the line between somebody who thinks he is or hopes he is and somebody who thinks he is and hopes he is and isn't is pretty fine. The difference between somebody who just has leanness in their soul and an idolater looks the same on the outside, right? This verse 7 is probably referencing Exodus chapter 32, where 32,000, over 3,000 of them died in this plague that they had brought. 3,000 of them. The plague of when they had worshipped the golden calf. You know, there's a thing that you hear sociologists today, a term that they use. Maybe you're familiar with it. Anybody heard the term shared responsibility? You know what that means? That's a euphemism for mob rule. You know, they'll talk about whenever there's riots. You know, there'll be a riot that takes place someplace, and it gets kind of out of hand, and then they start. You know, the protest turns into a riot, and then the riot turns into fire bombs and looting and chaos, and then some people die and everything. And the sociologists say, well, that's just shared responsibility. You know, that's all it is. It's just shared responsibility. You know, what that means is that there's a collective consciousness that takes place, and the individual's not responsible because they just kind of get caught up into it. It's what historically we've called mob rule. You know, and we not to get off track here, but I just think we live in a country today where you hear this mantra repeated about majority rules. Majority rules. You know, whatever the majority wants, this country was founded on the majority rules. Well, the majority rules can be a justification for gang rape. The majority may want something to be the case. That doesn't make it right. And it doesn't give those that are involved in that majority of being wrong an excuse. It doesn't alleviate them of responsibility. It's not some shared responsibility. It's an individual responsibility. And that's why, by the way, that's why our founding fathers did not devise a government that is majority rules. It's a majority that elects representatives who will rule. And then if you don't like what then that representative then will serve his constituency. And if the constituency doesn't like what that representative did, they're supposed to vote him out. But that's the very reason why our government isn't designed on that. But back to the text, verse 8 says, "And let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell." More died from this than they did from the golden calf thing. This is probably talking about Numbers chapter 25, when there was the whole thing about Balaam, and he had tried to curse the Israelites. Balak, the Moabite king, tried to get Balaam, who was supposedly this prophet, more false prophet than real prophet, and he wanted him to curse Israel and going to pay him a bunch of stuff, and he couldn't do it because God wouldn't let him, and he told Balak that, and Balaam said, well, I'll just keep giving you more money until finally you will. And he said, well, look, I'll do the best I can, but I got to tell you, whenever I open my mouth, it's whatever God puts in there. And so, you know, and he said, okay, well, we'll just go with that. You know, say what I want and you get a whole bunch of stuff. And so Balaam said, okay. So he gets up and he opens his mouth, and instead of cursing Israel, he blesses them. And Balaam's all like, what? You're supposed to curse him, you know? And he said, I told you, I can only do what God says. He said, but I tell you what, I can't curse him. Nobody can, except God. And so here's what you do. Send your Moabite women in there. And that'll do the trick. Because see, God's a holy God, and He doesn't go in for that sort of thing. So send your Moabite women, just put them on their Moabite best, and have them go in there, and God will curse them for you. And it worked. It did. God sent this plague. He had these vipers that went into the place, and I'm sorry, mixing my metaphors here. But he sent this plague, and they were dying. And it wasn't until Phineas, who was the grandson of Aaron, he was Aaron's grandson, and he finally said, I'm not going to take this anymore. And so he saw this Israelite guy that grabbed a Philistine or a Moabite woman. They went into this tent and started talking nice to each other. And he came in with his spear, and he just kind of like poked them both down into the ground. And all of Israel saw this, and they go, oh, man, what have we been doing? And he stopped. He stemmed the tide and stopped the plague then. And after 23,000 of them had died. Or said, not let us tempt Christ, verse 9. As some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. This is Numbers 21, and we'll conclude. This is the place with the snakes. And so in Numbers 21, they were complaining once again about their living conditions, and so God just said, oh man, what am I going to do with it? Oy vey. That was God's favorite word during the wilderness. Oy vey. And so he sent these snakes, these little poisonous vipers that went in the camp, and they were biting all the people, and they were dying from it. And so they went to Moses and said, oh, tell God we're sorry. We don't know where these snakes come from, but if you can just tell God we're sorry, we repent. So Moses goes to God and he says, well, I think it worked. They repented. And he said, okay, here's what you do, Mo. I want you to take this, take a bunch of bronze and make this big, tall staff thing and put a bronze snake on it, and then lift it up among the people. This is in Numbers 21. He says, lift it up among the people. And then those that, if they will look upon that standard, they'll look upon that bronze stick with the bronze snake wrapped around it. Bronze, by the way, in the Bible is a type of judgment. And he said when they look upon that, they'll be healed of their snake bites. And the word complain here in the New King James, it's the original language. It's an onomatopoetic word. And I just love to say that word, but it's an onomatopoetic word, which means the word sounds like what it means. You can almost, you don't even have to know the language. It's the word gonguzo, and it's onomatopoetic. The New King or the Old King New King James is probably not the best translation of it. Old King James is the word murmur. And if you were here today and you didn't speak English, and I went up to you and I just said murmur. You think, oh, I think I know what that word is, because it just sounds like what it means. It just has that sound to it, murmur. You can't even say it happy, murmur. It did. That doesn't work. And the New American and the NIV translated as grumble. That works too. Grumble. That's pretty onomatopoetic. Complain, not so much. Because we all say, oh, I'm not grumbling, I'm just complaining. We like that word better. And so, because of their complaining, Moses put up this stick, and he said, anybody that looks at it, they get healed of their snake bite. And a bunch of them did. All they had to do was look at it. And then no more snake bites. Snake bites are gone. They're cured. No more sickness. Not only were there no more snakes, there were no more snake bites. I wonder how many of them didn't look. Can't you just picture if you just look at it by faith, if you just look to the judgment of sin, and the snake is a type of sin, the Garden of Eden, chapter 3, we can see that imagery pretty clear. If you just look at it by faith, you can be recovered. We don't need a whole lot of explanation to understand the picture here, do we? It's pretty clear. And so as many of them as look by faith to the cross, that stick of judgment that where Christ was judged for our sins, he became sin for us. And those who look at it by faith are healed. They're cured. But how many of them don't? It's just, that's all we got to do is just look to it by faith and just say, God, I'm sorry. My sins put you there. I'm so sorry. And you said all I have to do is just believe that you are Lord, that you are my boss, you are my kurios, and then but how many of them don't? You know, how many of them, when people they would be cured of their snake bites, and they'd run over to their neighbor and says, the neighbor's laying there, and he's got these sores all over him, and he's swelling up, and his tongue's thick, and he's dying, can't even swallow because he's in such misery. And his neighbor comes up to him and he says, there's a cure. There's a cure. You don't even have to get a vaccine. There's a cure, a real cure. If you just look to that stick over there, just look on it by faith and just believe that God's in this, believe you'll be cured. How many of them said, oh, I'll look when I get done sowing my wild snake bites. I'm not done doing that yet. I mean, I've still got some things that I want, only hypocrites look. How many of them you think said that? How many of them say, well, I just, God didn't make me like all those goody two-shoe, snake bite healed people, How many people came up with an excuse just not to, by faith, bow before that tree, that stick, the place where their sins were judged? I don't know. Well, I would say I know, but I'm out of time, so I'll just say I don't know because I'm over time. But I don't know. Too many. But I think what we do is, what our takeaway from here is that we realize that, my life, old worn out cliche, I get it, I understand, but when people say that your life is the only Bible many people will ever read, but it's true. And if we are so bent on our rights, our way of doing things, that love doesn't become part of the equation, there's not going to be any incentive for people to look to the cure because they'll be too busy distracted by us. And I think for us as Christians, as people that understand what the love is all about, what the responsibility of love is, that we don't want that we don't want to be a hindrance, and so we own it. We own our failures and take it to the cross and receive the forgiveness and then go and sin no more, right? So God, I thank you for your grace, Lord, that is so immeasurable, it's so incomprehensible, it's so vast. We'll never exhaust its limits, where there's nowhere ever any time when we will say we fully understand it. Our brains are not big enough to do that. Your love is so broad, God. It's just what you accomplished when your Son came and died on the cross for us and took our place in judgment is so unfathomable. But it's true. It's real, God, and we believe it. We do believe it. And God, we just ask that you would, we want to be sanctified. We want to be conformed into his image. We want the world to look at us and see you, your Son. We want that to be the case. And the only way that can ever be accomplished is for us to be set aside. So God, as we were singing earlier, we want to open our hearts so that you would set us aside and use us for your glory. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.